TIAA is on a mission. Why? Because 54% of Black Americans don't have enough savings to retire. So in collaboration with big-name artists like Wyclef Jean, TIAA released Paper Right, new music inspiring a new financial future. With 100% of streaming sales going to a nonprofit that teaches students how to invest. Stream Paper Right now and help close the gap.
This is Hemant Mehta for the Friendly Atheist podcast. Jessica will be back next week. If you like what you're listening to, please go to patreon.com/friendlyatheistpodcast. Andrew Copson is the chief executive of Humanists UK, formerly known as the British Humanist Association, as well as the current president of the International Humanist and Ethical Union. He also studied classics and ancient and modern history at the University of Oxford. His new book is called Secularism, simply enough, and it's a primer on the history of the philosophy, what it means today, and how it offers a solution to some of the biggest conflicts in the world. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me. Let me just start out with a pretty basic question here that I think may still be important. What is the difference between a secular society and, let's say, an atheistic society? Because I know a lot of people tend to make those two synonymous.
Yeah, this is a common conceptual confusion, especially, I think, in North America. And I think to some extent it's a legacy of the sort of cultural fear of communism and the Soviet Union. Obviously, the Soviet Union pretended to be a secular state, but was in fact a very atheist one. And I think that has tarnished the brand to some extent of the secular state. But a secular state is a long, long way from being an atheist one. If you think about the origins of secularism and about the states in the world today that are secular, like France, like the United States of America, like India, these are states that are secular because they have a separation of religious institutions from state institutions. They try and give citizens and others within the borders the greatest possible freedom of belief that they can, compatible with the rights of others, and they treat people equally. They don't discriminate against them on grounds of religion or belief, or in favour of them on grounds of religion or belief. Those are the things that make a state secular, as opposed to being a religious state or an atheist state. And it's true that historically a lot of the proponents of secularism have been personally non-religious, but a lot of the proponents of secularism have been religious. People like Gandhi in India, people in the United States at the time of the revolution there who were religious believers. So there is a big, big difference between a state that is atheist and a state that is secular. There actually have never really been many atheist states in the history of human beings. I could only think of two or three for the book. Albania, Cuba, the Soviet Union at some periods in history and not at others. So they're two very, very different things.
And the UK, of course, because there is an official religion there, that you would not call a secular state?
The UK is not a secular state. Parts of the UK have almost secular states. So, for example, the national administration in Scotland is secular. The national administration in Wales and in Northern Ireland are secular, and the church was disestablished in Wales and in Northern Ireland in the past. But England is a Christian state, and the UK itself is a Christian state, so not a secular one. Now, of course, like many European states, the majority of its political business is secular in practice. So it's been a long time since, the church has literally ruled Europe.
So this is a strange irony then that England, which you're saying is religious in nature, versus the United States, which is theoretically secular, and yet it feels like we see a lot more religiosity in the United States, and not just religiosity, but religious power in government. So are we almost better off with a like an official state religion? Would that be better for us?
That's a fascinating question. And a lot of people, some people have seriously advanced this argument that, established churches might be better ways of securing freedom and equality than secular states are. I mean, I don't think that's true. But you're right that there's no necessary connection between having a secular state and having a non-religious society. Now, the UK has one of the most non-religious societies in the world. The majority of people in the UK don't have a religious identity. The majority of people in the UK don't have religious beliefs, and a large majority of them don't engage in any sort of religious practice. We're a mostly non-religious society, but we have a religious state. In America, the United States of America, like you say, there's a secular state, but a quite religious society. And the two things don't necessarily have to go together. So it shouldn't surprise us necessarily that that's the case, although it does look strange. It looks odd, especially if your assumption is that a secular state will be there because, society is non-religious. And of course, a country like India, which has a secular state, is a also very religious country in practice, especially in identity terms. So secular states don't mean necessarily non-religious societies. Whether or not, your second question, whether or not the secularity of the state has something to do with the power of religion in society, I think that's a very interesting question. There's no doubt that American secularism, as distinct from French secularism or Indian secularism, there's no doubt that American secularism explicitly is designed to protect religious people from the state. There's freedom from religion envisaged in the American Constitution, of course, but it's primarily really freedom of religion that secularism is meant to guarantee. And I think for that reason, religious life in the United States hasn't been interfered with by the secular state in the way people might argue it has been in the past in Turkey or in France or in India. So the secular state might be a reason why there's a very religious population. But I think we'd need, more evidence. And with all types of historical claims, of course, it's very hard to run the experiment again, right? It's quite hard to, it's impossible to go back in time and give the fledgling United States a Christian constitution to see whether or not it would have made society less religious or more.
I don't think there are people who would like to run that experiment.
Yeah, that's not an experiment that I would like to see. The UK, of course, is a very non-religious society, but I don't think that has much to do with the fact that we have a Christian state. I think it's much more to do with the fact that we've had a non-religious society for a very long time. That being the first country to being the first society to industrialize, then being the first society to do all sorts of very significant things. The fact that the UK has been a country whose society has encountered a lot of other civilizations in its time. The encounter with Indian thought and with Chinese civilizations and with other ways of thinking and doing things has helped the secularization of society in the UK in all sorts of ways. Urbanization, the welfare state, high levels of social security relative to other parts of the world. The scientific revolution, the British Enlightenment, and so on. I think have all been far more important political and economic and social factors than the fact that the Church of England remains established.
What do you say to religious people who might come up to you and ask you, why is secularism good for them? Because, like you said, if some people take that as being atheistic, they may not want to see separation of church and state. What's your argument to them as to why they should basically buy what you're selling?
Well, some people are never going to be persuaded, of course. And, some people are immune to any sort of discussion about these points because their mind is already made up. Theocratic opponents of secularism are in that category. Then you're never going to have persuaded the Ayatollah Khomeini that liberal democracy and a secular state was the right way to go because he was convinced that, or at least he said he was convinced, he claimed to be convinced that, God had said exactly how the state should be ordered, and it was just his obligation to follow those rules. So some people are never going to convince. But if I assume that the religious person I'm speaking to wants to be free, cares about freedom for themselves, and if I'm also going to assume that the religious person I'm talking to wants fairness in society, wants some fair treatment, both of themselves and of others, then I think that we who advocate secularism can make a pretty convincing case, because it is hard to imagine that human freedom can be given full development in a situation where the state limits your choices for you, lays down what its religion is going to be, promotes that religion through its state institutions, for example, in public schools, makes decisions for you about what the law says you can and can't do based on its religion, not your own beliefs. It's hard to envisage how human freedom can really flourish in that sort of situation. And it's hard also to envisage how such a state could really treat people fairly. I mean, let's say that the founding fathers of the United States had decided that the Constitution shouldn't ban religious tests for public office, and in fact they were going to require all public officials and all state employees of every kind to be non-conforming Protestants, let's say. I mean, clearly, plainly, that would be unfair on all the other citizens of the United States who believed something different. So if I'm assuming that the religious person I'm speaking to has a commitment to the rights of others, has a certain level of compassion and empathy, and wants to see some fairness in the world, as well as be free themselves, then I think they're the sorts of arguments that I would make. I mean, some religions, of course, have distinctively religious cases for secularism. If you think about a Christian denomination like the Baptists, who were some of the first advocates of state secularism in the West, their theology is such that it was then, it is still now. Their theology is such that no one can come between the human person and God. A person's religious life is between them and God. And since it's on that person whether they believe or not, and they'll have to suffer the consequences after this life is over of whatever their beliefs are, there's no legitimate reason why the king, as it then was, or government, as it now is, should seek to come between that individual and God. That's a very distinctive Christian theological, case for secularism. The Baptists used to say, the king shall not answer for, the individual's conscience, so he shouldn't try to dictate it either. So there are Christian arguments like that. There are arguments made by Muslims on the basis of Quranic texts about how there shouldn't be any compulsion in religion to justify secular states. And there are stories from the Bible that are used by some Christians. And of course, very devout Hindu believers like Mahatma Gandhi himself found resources within their own religious beliefs to advocate secularism. So I think that there's no reason to assume that religious believers will, because of their religious belief, necessarily be opponents of secularism, and in some cases quite the opposite. So I hope that either because they're reasonable, compassionate people, or because their religions might even point them in this direction too, I hope that most religious believers are persuadable of the case for secularism.
When it comes to advocating for secularism, what do you see as the greatest challenges? And I ask this on a global scale in the UK and in the US.
Well, globally, I think that the biggest challenge for those who want the state to be secular is probably the rise of what I might loosely call sort of cultural and ethnic nationalism. So with the current government of India, for example, which is for the first time in India a Hindu nationalist or Hindu conservative government, with the Islamism of Erdogan and his party in Turkey, and with the Russian state, Putinism, as it were, which is also in its project of national unity and strong man actions, has sort of yoked the Orthodox Church to it to be part of this ethnic nationalism. So I think all of those negative features of the world today, which threaten secularism and threaten the secular state, and threaten a lot of other liberal institutions as well. They certainly threaten the secular state. All of those, I think, are manifestations of a sort of cultural ethnic nationalism which is rising in the world right now. of course, that's before you even begin to consider Islamic fundamentalism in the Arab world and in Southeast Asia, which similarly is often, especially in Southeast Asia, part of the project of nation building in the hands of some pretty nationalistic and certainly very fundamentalist political actors. So I think that that's the global challenge, really, is ethnic nationalism, religious fundamentalism. The challenge in the UK, I suppose it's difficult to look at your own country with the same sort of detachment as you might try to apply to other countries. I try to do it, obviously, in connection with the UK. The UK's problem, I think, is a sort of conservatism, small c conservatism, a sort of inertia, because although we do have probably the biggest mismatch in the world between state and society, we have a very Christian state and a very non-religious society. The mismatch between the two is very great. People don't tend to think much about that or care much about it. They care about individual manifestations of it. So the fact that they might not be able to get their child into the local state, public school because that school is one of our public schools that are run by a church and they choose who to admit on religious grounds, right? So people care about it in those flashpoints in their lives, but in the round, they don't care about it too much. And so I think that a sort of inert attitude, a sort of conservatism in the UK is probably the biggest opponent of the chance of our state ever being secular. And never had a successful permanent revolution in the UK, never got round to writing a constitution, never had to face those sort of tough decisions about what sort of state we will have. And so as a result, those decisions have never been taken and things have, just continued as they have been. The exceptions, as I said before, are Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales, which in their own national governments beneath the UK government have actually established secular states. But elsewhere, I think just the lack of political innovation in the UK is the biggest threat to a future secular state. In the United States, that's very difficult. I think the United States, although politics has become very much religionized in large portions, it hasn't become a Christian state. The state is still secular, and if the secular nature of the state hasn't prevented this Christianization of politics, at least it will allow the de-Christianization of politics over time, which I think will happen again over time. And I think that the United States, in spite of that, remains a very good example of a political unit that allows a large measure of freedom of religion or belief, freedom of thought, conscience, and so on and so forth. Probably one of the most free societies in that respect in history. And so I think that the resilience of American secularism in terms of state secularism will probably prove to be very great, as resilient as the nature of the US Constitution. So I think that those things will probably current problems will clear themselves up. And of course, although the two don't necessarily go hand in hand, it is often the case that as society becomes less religious, state secularism is easier to protect and enforce. And I think it's clear that there is a non-religionization of American society, albeit from a much higher base than we're used to in Europe, which will play its part in, I think, re-secularizing politics and the state over the medium term. That would be, predictions are notoriously impossible. Now I've said that, probably next week President Trump will declare a theocracy or something, and I
wouldn't put it behind him. Yeah.
Completely refuted. But I would be relatively hopeful. I'd be much more hopeful about the United States secularism than I would be about secularism in the world in general.
Speaking of which, is there like a model secular country that you could say this is a country that's doing it right?
Well, I think it's very hard to say that. First of all, there are lots of different definitions of state secularism. In the book and in general, I am a big fan of the definition by the French scholar Barbaro, who says that secularism has three parts. The first is the separation of religious institutions and state institutions. The second is the freedom of thought, conscience, religion, and belief. And the third is equal treatment of people based on religion and belief, as I said earlier on. And I think if you take that definition of Barbaro, which is by and large the definition also used by secularist activists today and in the past, and in many secular states' constitutions as well. So it's a real working definition. If you take that definition and try and see whether there are any states in the world today that match up to it, that compare well with it, I think that, like I say, the United States does relatively well. I think France does relatively well. And I think that India does relatively well too. But all those three types of secularism, though, in America, France, and India, are all very different from each other, as well as all, according more or less with Barbaro's definition, they have a lot of distinctive characteristics to them as well. So I don't think there's one single recipe for a secular state, because although the values that underpin secularism are universal, the way in which it's constituted in practice in different states will inevitably be dependent on national history, national culture, the political situation at the point when secularism was or will be made formal, made official, the religious demography of the country in question. So you can point to states that have good constitutions, where all the wording is excellent, and that really should, in theory, match up. The Constitution of Fiji is a good recent example, which has got an exemplar clause in its constitution about the secular nature of the state. But going beyond that, going beyond black letter law to what the real situation is on the ground, I think it's more difficult to say. And the problem is that every secularism is different from each other.
What do you see as the biggest problem that you think we as activists can actually overcome or maybe solve, before our lifetime?
Again, of course, it depends where we are in the world. I think that that is a big factor in answering that question. If I'll try to give an international answer first, and then maybe think about some specific countries. Internationally, I think that secularists' best hope, and I think that also this is the best hope, by the way, of humanists on the moral front, as well as secularists on the political front. I think the best task we can set ourselves to at the present time is defending the international human rights order. I think that, this year is the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Of course, no human-made thing is ever perfect. There's no such thing as perfection in this reality, and no reason to believe that there is perfection in any other either. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the concept of legal human rights, fundamental universal human rights for every person in general, I think is the best hope for secularists on the political front. The Universal Declaration itself, is a high point in the 20th century in 1948 of secularist achievement, both because it contains strong guarantees on things like freedom of thought and conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of belief, freedom of association, which secularism wants to protect, but also because in drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it wasn't just people from one culture or one tradition or one country or one ethnicity that were involved. Representatives from states all over the world voted to adopt the Universal Declaration. People from many different cultures were involved in writing it. It draws its inspiration from all sorts of human thought and philosophy and belief and conviction. And in that way, it's not just secularist in content, it's secularist in the way it was brought into being. So I think that if states in today's world, especially big rights-abusing states like Russia or China or Turkey or Islamic states, but also plenty of other states as well in the West, if states really took seriously their commitment and their obligations under international human rights treaties, then I think a lot of problems would be solved. And on the flip side of the coin, if we continue this drift away from seeking to enforce international human rights treaties, then things will get, I think pretty bad pretty quickly. And you need to remember what the world was like in the decades before the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and those terrible events which inspired and motivated the adoption of the Universal Declaration, to see how bad it could get. So I think it's important, the work that organizations, human rights organizations and humanist organizations do in the international institutions like the United Nations, and in lobbying their own governments to both observe human rights norms and lobby other governments to observe human rights norms, whether through sanctions or diplomatic means, is probably the most important, the highest impact thing that we could do internationally. Now, I think locally and regionally in particular countries, the struggles will all be different. I think that in the UK, for example, the biggest campaign would be around the public school system, which is entirely taxpayer funded, but a third of which is controlled by churches or other religious groups which control curriculum and admissions and all other sorts of things. So, and in other countries, the target of campaigning zeal will be different.
What are the biggest issues that you're working on with Humanists UK right now?
Well, precisely what I was just talking about, actually, which is the what are called faith schools in our national jargon, the state-funded religious schools that often select their pupils on religious grounds and always teach a very particular religious curriculum.
And how are you actually going about trying to change that then?
So a lot of, in lots of different ways. So a lot of work is done locally because lots of schools are either set up or monitored locally. So through lobbying local authorities, local councils, county councils. A lot of work is done nationally. There's a humanist group in Parliament of 120 parliamentarians, and Humanists UK and its members obviously lobby in Parliament. A lot of work is done with government, and we meet quite often with the Department for Education in order to try and enforce some of the laws that do exist to restrict the sort of discrimination that occurs in state religious schools. So there's a lot of awareness raising there and enforcement and compliance work that we contribute to. But like all political campaigns, change has to come from the legislators. And now the campaign against faith schools has been boosted in the last 16 years because it was in 2002 that new religious schools started being opened in serious numbers. Before then, the general feeling, I think, was that they would slowly be phased out. They would wither on the vine, that they weren't, they might not be going anywhere fast, but they would slowly normalize, become perhaps more like normal community schools or close. So on and so forth. And then in 2002, the British government decided they wanted to actually reverse that trend, increase the number of faith schools. And that gave a big boost to the campaign against faith schools because suddenly they didn't look like an artifact from history, a bit of rubble from the past that would slowly be eroded, but a new threat to liberal education and to secular public services. And in that time, the campaign that Humanists UK has been running, I think, has been instrumental in making public opinion turn against state-funded faith schools. The large majority of the public, it depends which question you ask, but it's always well over 70%, don't think that it's right, that these schools are being expanded, and a majority also think it's not right that they exist at all. Now, the question, obviously, is when does that become an opinion that government can no longer avoid? And the problem here is that there are very powerful lobby groups on both the Roman Catholic and the Church of England side that are very strong advocates, obviously, of keeping the schools that they run. And the tipping point will come when government no longer has to listen to that lobby and instead can listen to both the majority of people in the country and also the good public policy advice that almost every expert agrees on, to say that schools should be secular and for the whole community. Now, when that point comes, I don't know, but the job of advocacy organisations in the meantime, I think, is to continue to build the evidence base that shows that such schools are divisive, bad for community cohesion, don't match up to what we want from schools in terms of children's rights, and build coalitions with other organisations to make that social change more likely. So it's one of the most pleasing features of Humanist UK's campaign over the last decade and a bit has been the support that it increasingly receives from religious leaders, rabbis and priests who agree that education should be inclusive, from education unions. I mean, we recently had a letter published in the Daily Telegraph, which is a right-wing newspaper in the UK, which was signed not only by lots of humanists and lots of religious leaders, but also by the two general secretaries of the National Education Union, who are also concerned and increasingly agreeing with our policy position. So, building coalitions with the end in sight, the point perhaps a couple of decades from now in sight, when government will find it more useful to listen to us than to the religious lobbies that they currently appease.
I had one last question for you. In the introduction to your book, I was so curious about this. You thanked somebody by name who, quote, took out China from a draft of the book. And that's an atheistic country, though it's pretty repressive, too. But why not include them? Why not talk about them more?
Well, I do talk about them briefly as an example of a state that is, says that it's secular but isn't. Elizabeth O'Casey, that's her name, the person who I thank for taking out China. And she is the director of advocacy at Humanists International, previously the International Humanist and Ethical Union. And she and I were having a drink in Oslo. I think it was Oslo or Vienna. I can't remember. Anyway, it was somewhere away at a meeting. And I was complaining about how it was impossible to cut this book down to the right length because it's a short book. It's intended. It was commissioned by Oxford University Press to be a short introduction to secularism. So it wasn't allowed to be more than 35,000 words. And I was having a real struggle because I'd got 60,000 words or whatever. I was having a real struggle cutting it down. And I said to her, and I've got this whole chapter on China. And she said, why on earth have you got China? China isn't an example of a secular state. So why would you spend a lot of time looking at China rather than states that actually are, do have a legitimate claim to be secular and that must form part of your introduction? If you're going to deal with China, just deal with it as being an example of a not really secular state that claims to be. So she took out, and with that remark, she took out the China chapter from my mind. So I was very grateful to her because it saved me a lot of agony and a lot of time.
Well, very good. The book is called Secularism, Politics, Religion, and Freedom. And Andrew Copson, thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you.